and I'm here to support you. So Biden's visit to Poland was a bit of, like, I guess, was for the purpose of raising their morale. But notice, Conrad, shifting over to Transnistria, Transnistria, and Moldova, Biden does actually mention Moldova in his Warsaw, Poland presentation, which I think is very key as well, because Poland doesn't have much to do with Moldova as much as, say, Romania does, but he still mentions it. So it seems like the US, at least the deep state and the State Department, the military-industrial complex, is interested in both Transnistria and Moldova and the future of those particular territories.
Oh yeah, and right before we go there, when it comes to, Biden and Zelensky, it seems that even the Ukrainians were actually a little bit more interested in kind of reviewing the Chinese proposals and everything, but the US, of course, immediately overstepping, and it seems that their US is a bit afraid of the Russians and the Chinese clearly coming together. That's something that I think is making them a little bit nervous. But yeah, when it comes to Transnistria, we saw, of course, the government of Moldova earlier this week collapsed, and they have a new prime minister. Maya Sandu before was a total US puppet. It seems the new person is just as much of a puppet. There was big news being spread supposedly of that the Russians were going to commit a coup in Moldova and put in a pro-Russian, and because the former prime minister before Sandu was very pro-Russian, he is out in the streets. I believe Dodon is his name. He's out in the streets kind of leading these anti-NATO protests. A lot of these Moldovans are they're pro-Russian. They're against getting dragged into this conflict on behalf of the West. And there was even rumor that Russia was going to take control of the Chisinau airport in Moldova and be able to fly troops in there. And of course, for those that don't know, Transnistria is this region along the Dniester River, the border with Moldova and Ukraine, that is part of Moldova legally, not even recognized legally by anybody else, but is effectively controlled by a pro-Russian separatist government and has what I believe to be about 1,500 Russian troops in it. As has a large ammunition depot, one of the largest, and it's something that Russia doesn't want to give up. It gives them, in theory, a direct way to have a pincer maneuver on Odessa, on some of the farther parts in western Ukraine. And we have rumors that the Ukrainians are going to perhaps do an assault on Transnistria. There was reinforcements on the roads going into and from Ukraine in Transnistria. Of course, they have their own military as well, which I believe has 5,000 troops. And again, this combined force of, maybe 7,000 guys is not going to be enough to repel something that the Ukrainians, combined perhaps with the Moldovans, would want to do. And we're going to see if Russia has a response. Of course, I don't think that Russia could afford necessarily to give that up. And it seems that if Russia is going to do something, they would need to secure the kind of southern exclave of Ukraine west of Odessa to then be able to supply Tiraspol, which is the capital of Transnistria, with the necessary supplies that they would need to resist some kind of Ukrainian takeover. And eventually, most likely, if that happened, Russia would use that resupply operation from Crimea. That's where it would go. They would use that to then launch another assault to Odessa and fully complete the land bridge as well as the Black Sea being occupied entirely for Russia. So there's some other things going on with Transnistria and everything. Dimitri, I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so what Conrad's mentioning here is essentially the potential Russian huge naval as well as air assault upon the western bank of of the Black Sea, adjacent to Odessa. Of course, I don't believe the Russians, and I don't think Conrad either. I don't think the Russians will straight away go into a siege of Odessa, which was a pretty significant city based on the Russians' recent reputation of sieging cities successfully or not. Kherson was probably the best example of Russians taking it quite quickly, but I believe Odessa has been getting at least spoken of since the beginning of the war. So I think Odessa is very much prepared by the Ukrainians for a siege. But yes, the Russian goal would be to resupply Transnistria, and the only way to do that, and to of course support Transnistria military, would be to drop their forces off in the Odessa, you can call it the Odessa Oblast, I suppose, adjacent to the Black Sea, via ships and of course a great helicopters, and of course begin the land assault past Moldova all the way into Transnistria, maybe even crossing the Moldovan border, which would naturally, Moldova isn't a NATO member, so this isn't going to trigger Article 5. But if the Moldovans don't want to get involved, they really need to stay out of not only Transnistria, but also allow the Russians to cross their territory in order to quickly get to Transnistria, which will be key. And of course, there will be international outrage, but how far can this outrage go? Past the 12,000 sanctions? Probably nowhere. So Moldova will have to sit there quietly and wait for the Russians to hypothetically process all of their troops, assist Transnistria, protect it from the Ukrainian invasion. As you said, Conrad, there's no way the Russians want to give all of these Soviet-era depots and military ammunition storage, storage warehouses to the Ukrainians, because some of the Ukrainian equipment, sure, it does belong to NATO. They use NATO ammunition, NATO rounds, NATO bombs, but again, half of the Ukrainian military at least still uses its old Soviet technology. Especially some of the artillery shells, they still use some of that Soviet type ammunition, which are stored in Transnistria. Now, on top of this, we may see many provocations. Like there was people speaking about Russia potentially causing a false flag nuclear reactor explosion in Ukraine, actually to prevent Ukrainians from, of course, assaulting west into Transnistria. There's also talk about just like the Nord Stream 1, mysteriously was, blown up by some sort of secret power. Now it turns out it was Norwegians working with Americans, of course, after the famous article was released. Now, of course, that's kind of still, the jury's still out on that, but we do believe it's probably the US that was behind that. But there may be a lot of false flags within Transnistria in the coming weeks. For example, these ammunition depots actually exploding, because we did see, remember, Russia bombing some of the depots near Lvov on the west side of Ukraine, and the explosions were akin to something nuclear. They looked enormous, like the huge mushrooms, of course. And so there may be mysterious explosions within Transnistria even before the Ukrainians actually begin their assault, and the Ukrainians may use this as some sort of leeway to say, hey, Transnistrians need our assistance, let's go help them out. So there could be all kinds of provocations. We're talking about CIA agents, we're talking about all kinds of black ops. So, of course, a lot of pressure in Transnistria. Now, their president is incredibly based. He's not only red-pilled on, say, Russian history of Vadim Krasnoselsky, but he's also somewhat of an Orthodox monarchist. He's an Orthodox Christian himself, and he has quite a good reputation amongst Russians. He actually loves Russian culture, Russian history, and he understands Transnistria's part, or Pridnestrovye, as it's called in Russian, as it relates to Russia. Now, an interesting note before I hand it off, Conrad. Of course, everybody knows the famous military commentator and the former Minister of Defense of Donetsk, Igor Strelkov, the one who ostensibly created the entire conflict in 2014. Allegedly, the Ukrainians blame him for moving from Crimea to Slavyansk and starting the entire war. But Strelkov did fight actually in the Transnistrian civil war against Moldova in 1991-92. In fact, that's primarily where he got his military experience prior to Chechnya. So Strelkov is a veteran of the Pridnestrovye conflicts right as the Soviet Union fell apart. So this is kind of coming full circle. Like, this great guy, I guess, this great character of recent history who began the entire thing, his military career began in Pridnestrovye, Transnistria, and now Transnistria, Pridnestrovye seems to be like this potential hypothetical breaking point for the entire conflict. It is the opening of the second front, so to speak, now that the east is heavily occupied by the Russians. So it's quite interesting, I think, what we potentially could see from this. It's somewhat horrifying.
Well, and for us map artists, it really scratches that itch. I mean, this is just a little unrecognized breakaway micro-state along a river. It's a few highways and towns strung together on a map. But then there's less than 400,000 people that live there now, but yet they're becoming a linchpin of civilizational conflict. And the quote, one of the best quotes from Vadim Krasnoselsky, the third president of Transnistria, he said, "For some reason we are considered only a fragment of the Soviet Union, a fragment of Lenin, etc. No, that's not true. If we are a splinter, then of the Russian Empire," saying that he identifies at least Transnistria as part of the Russian Empire, which people find funny because the Transnistrian flag has a hammer and sickle on it and everything. But again, we understand that the usage of these signals has much more to do with a combination of perhaps a nostalgia for a time before the 90s, as well as just a claim to legitimacy against the nation states that popped up around it. Transnistria claims that they were never asked and that they never had a say in the formation of these new states after the fall of the Soviet Union, whether it was Moldova, Ukraine, any of these places that got broken up as the former Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union got balkanized. And so they are, of course, going to hold on to those symbols because it is how they are able to maintain legitimacy. And let's be real, does Transnistria have the capability to remake a flag right now? I mean, I don't think so. So I think we're about to see some big changes there. But when it comes to Moldova, I mean, of course, the split in Moldova is whether or not they want to rejoin Romania. For those that don't know, Moldovans speak Romanian. Moldova has a lot of Russians in it too, especially Transnistria. So it's not to say that there isn't an argument there, but the Moldovan Orthodox Church is also directly under the Moscow Patriarchate. And it's important to note that the Moldovan Orthodox Church was one of the most based churches, whether it was during COVID or during any of the crazy nonsense that's happened in the past 5 years. Their bishops and metropolitans have stood very strong. So I have a lot of respect for the Moldovan Orthodox Church, but we know that I think it's already slightly happening, but there's going to be even more of a push, likely aided by the US, for perhaps Moldovan autocephaly, or who knows what else we'll see. So especially if with Transnistria getting involved, Moldova will become, who knows, if Transnistria goes and becomes part of, the new annexed territory of Russia, they'll probably work hard to get Moldova into NATO. And Russia's going to have to use some of its soft power to, at the very least, secure it as a neutral state. And, we know where that whole neutral state NATO talk goes, and we've been in that for over a year now. So things are getting interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, that's right. There is that constant pressure, at least on the Moldovan Orthodox Church, from its larger neighbor. I guess the at the moment the Romanian Orthodox Church, of course, wishes to absorb the Moldovan people, as well as perhaps kick out the Russian Orthodox Church from Moldova and kind of take on the Moldovan people as its own. Now, this has been, of course, a point of discussion at least for at least 2 centuries now. So it's kind of an old gripe between the Russian and the Romanian Church. All that needs to be said here is that the Romanian Orthodox Church is by far the youngest Orthodox Church which has a patriarch.